On the morning of March 12, 1928, the most trusted engineer in California stood at the base of a 205-foot dam and looked at a leak. He studied it for 2 hours. He said it was fine. 14 hours later, the dam wasn't there. Here's the uncomfortable part. He wasn't being careless. By the standards of his day, that leak was ordinary. Every concrete dam leaks. The arithmetic on his drawings balanced. The rock under his boots was hard. And at 11:57 that night, all of it let go at once. It took 60-odd years and a geologist with a stereoscope to work out what was really happening under that hillside while he was standing on it. The answer isn't in the concrete, it's in a landslide that stopped moving sometime back in the Ice Age. So this is a case file. The St. Francis Dam in San Francisquito Canyon, north of Los Angeles, California. A structure that worked on paper, worked on the ledger, worked fine for 2 years, and then killed more than 400 people in 5.5 hours. Let's try it like a case. The defendant first. William Mulholland, Irish immigrant, self-taught, no engineering degree, the man who'd hauled water 233 miles from the Owens Valley and made modern Los Angeles possible. Ranchers up north were dynamiting his aqueduct. He wanted a year's supply stored close to home. So, a curved concrete gravity dam, 205 feet tall measured up from its foundation, 700 feet along the crest, 16 feet thick at the top, and roughly 170 at the bottom. A stepped downstream face, 12.4 billion gallons behind it for about $1.25 million. Then, mid-project, it grew. Mulholland raised the St. Francis Dam 10 feet, then 10 feet again, 185 to 205, to bank more water. The base width never changed. That's the one decision every investigator since has circled in red ink. Other big dams of that decade had a cut-off trench under the upstream heel, a grout curtain, an inspection gallery, drainage wells to bleed off water pressure from underneath. The St. Francis Dam had almost none of it. 10 relief wells under the center section. The abutments got nothing at all. Then the canyon itself. 2 very different rocks meet in San Francisquito Canyon along an old fault line. The west side is Sespe conglomerate, a red cemented sandstone that softens in water. The east side is Pelona schist, gray mica rock that splits along its own grain like a bad deck of cards. No geologist was ever hired to examine either one before construction. In 1924, that wasn't a scandal. Engineering geology barely existed as a profession. You looked at the rock, you hit it with a hammer, you decided it was competent. Mulholland looked and decided it was competent. The dam was finished in 1926, and the reservoir crept up over 2 years. In February 1928, the pool climbed past the 1830-foot mark and stayed there 36.5 days of full pressure, the longest soak that foundation had ever taken. On March 7th, water reached the spillway. Leaks appeared, they always do. Cracks in the concrete were grouted and written off as shrinkage. But seepage on the west side started running muddy, and muddy water coming out from under a dam means one specific thing to an engineer. The foundation itself is going somewhere. Meanwhile, on the east side, the road along the reservoir rim began to sag. Drivers noticed steps forming in the dirt. One family driving past that evening had to dig ramps for their tires to climb a 12-inch drop. Nobody connected a sagging road to a moving hillside. March 12th. Damkeeper Tony Harnischfeger, who lived in a cottage a quarter-mile below the dam with his 6-year-old son, reported the muddy leak. Mulholland drove out with Harvey Van Norman, his chief assistant. They spent 2 hours on it and traced the mud to a road cut upstream. Which wasn't unreasonable. There genuinely was roadwork above the reservoir. Muddy runoff had an innocent explanation, and every other indicator looked normal. Mulholland told Harnischfeger to keep an eye on it and drove back to Los Angeles, California. That's the last routine thing that ever happened at that dam. Around 8 that evening, the recorded reservoir level began to drop. Not dramatically. There's a paper trace from the water level recorder on the crest that shows it. Nobody was watching it. Read today, that falling line looks less like water leaving and more like the dam beginning to lift. Two powerhouse employees drove past between 11:35 and 11:40 and saw nothing unusual. The canyon was pitch dark. Around 11:50, a carpenter named Ace Hopewell rode over the crest on a motorcycle. A half-mile on, he heard a rumble and assumed it was a rock slide. At 11:57 and 30 seconds, a transmission line downstream went dead. That's our timestamp. The failure clocked itself by killing the power. There were no witnesses. Everything we know about the next 90 seconds was reconstructed from concrete blocks, scour lines on the canyon walls, and photographs. By morning, one piece was still standing, the center monolith, alone in an empty canyon, with a crack across its base. The papers called it the tombstone. Investigators numbered the scattered fragments 1 through 44, and the argument about which one moved first started immediately. Suspects, then, start with the easy ones. Sabotage. Mulholland floated it himself, and the aqueduct had been bombed before. But dynamite leaves a signature: shattered concrete, blast fracturing, a crater. There isn't one. An earthquake? No seismic record supports it, and the rumble Hopewell felt was the dam. Next, the concrete. It was unreinforced and light, about 141 pounds per cubic foot, mixed with local gravel that wasn't always washed clean. Genuinely mediocre material. But the tombstone stood there through the entire flood without moving. The concrete wasn't good. It also wasn't what broke. Now the official answer. 6 engineers and geologists appointed by Governor C.C. Young reported in April 1928 that the foundation was defective, and they pointed west, at that red Sespe conglomerate, a rock you can crumble in a glass of water. Their evidence: the blocks thrown furthest downstream came from the west end. Furthest traveled equals first to go. Reasonable, it's how you'd read a car crash. Then, 60 years on, a geological engineer named J. David Rogers went back to hundreds of the 1928 photographs and built stereo pairs. Overlapping images, viewed in stereo, give you depth. Depth gives measurement. Rogers matched the scattered blocks to where each one had stood in the dam. The pieces thrown furthest weren't from the west end at all. They came from the east, the schist side. For 60 years, investigators had been reading the wreckage from the wrong side of the canyon. Then he mapped the shape of that east hillside: a bowl at the top, a bulge at the toe, the ridgeline stepping down in a long curved scar. That wasn't a hillside. That was an enormous prehistoric landslide, long dormant, with the dam's east abutment built into the middle of it. Here's the mechanism. 36 days at full pool drove water deep into the layered mica schist. Pressure built inside the rock's own grain. That pressure did two jobs at once. It began floating the dam off a foundation with no drainage to relieve it, and it relubricated an ancient slide. Around 11:55, a block beside the east abutment let go and opened a nozzle. 2 minutes later, the abutment itself went. Something like 1.5 million tons of wet schist moved against 270,000 tons of concrete. That's not a contest, that's an eviction. So the conviction, not the concrete, not the conglomerate, not a saboteur. The St. Francis Dam died of water pressure in ground nobody had yet learned to read, inside a structure that gave that pressure nowhere to go. Every number on the drawings was right. The drawings weren't the whole problem. 12.4 billion gallons left in a little over an hour. A wall of water roughly 140 feet high in the canyon, 40 feet at a construction camp on the county line, about 30 feet through Santa Paula, California, just past 3 in the morning. It reached the Pacific at 5:30. 64 of the dead were powerhouse workers and their families, most at powerhouse number 2, a mile and a half downstream. 84 of 140 Edison linemen died in their tents at Kemp Station. Harnischfeger and his son were almost certainly first. Neither body was ever recovered. People did save people. A night switchboard operator in Santa Paula, California, named Louise Geep stayed at her board, ringing houses while the water came. 2 motorcycle officers, Thornton Edwards and Stanley Baker, rode street to street, knocking on every third door and telling those neighbors to wake the rest. At the coroner's inquest, Mulholland didn't hedge. "Fasten it on me," he said. "If there was an error of human judgment, I was the human." The jury cleared him of any crime and wrote one line that reshaped American practice: "A great dam should never be left to the judgment of one man." Now the honest part, because this case isn't fully closed. The ancient landslide beneath the east abutment is well established. Rogers published it in the early 1990s, and the reassessment he wrote with David McMahon sits in the dam safety literature. What it means is still argued about. Hard. The historians Norris Hundley and Donald Jackson, in their 2015 book Heavy Ground, push back. Their case: uplift pressure was understood well before 1928. Cut-off trenches and drainage wells were standard on comparable dams, and this design fell short of its own era's practice. Landslide or no landslide? I think both are true, and that's the interesting finding. A hillside nobody in 1924 could have read, plus a base with no drainage and no trench, plus 20 extra feet of height on an unchanged footprint. The geology set the trap. The design walked in without a single relief well in the abutments. And the count. Contemporary papers guessed anywhere from 400 to 600. The most careful modern work is by the anthropologist Anne Stansel, who rebuilt the roster from coroner's records, newspapers, and cemetery plots. 411 named people. Some victims were migrant workers, no one officially registered. The exact number is unknowable. California licensed its civil engineers and built a state dam safety agency within 18 months. Geologists stopped being optional. If you appreciate stories like this, give us a like and follow. It really helps the channel. And as always, stay curious, stay careful, and remember, every failure is a lesson somebody paid for.